case of Kenneth Bianchi, otherwise known as the Hillside Strangler. If you're a true crime fan, you've probably heard of this case. For you who don't know, he was apprehended for about a dozen murders of young women in California between October 1977 and February 1978. He buried them in the surrounding hills, hence the moniker, the Hillside Strangler, along with his cousin. So I won't go into it now, but I kind of dissect into my book how he created a false narrative of him suffering from multiple personality disorder. He actually tricked quite a few forensic psychiatrists, my own brethren, who frankly I thought were very naive, but he was tricked by a trickster. So there was a psychologist to Martin Orne, I don't know if that's Orne, O-R-N-E, who made Bianchi change his story by telling him certain mistruths about that diagnosis. So it's a very sort of clever way of trapping him and making him look guilty. Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. I'm also a YouTuber, and as of the 10th of March of this year, I will have been a published author. My book, In Two Minds, is going to be released by Shpere Publishing, who are a subsidiary of Little Brown Hachette. So make sure you pronounce that properly. Don't call it Hachette like I've been doing for the past year like an ass, until somebody pointed out that it's a French company and it's pronounced Hachette. Bless you. So today I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm going to kind of skim read a chapter of my book, and I'm going to tell you about a real life case where basically I think somebody used mental illness as an excuse to try and get away with an offence, even though I told the court that I thought this was happening. This is kind of like the experience of listening to an audiobook, I guess. I'm not going to read it verbatim, otherwise the video would be too long. In the comments section, when I've mentioned my book in previous videos, many people have asked whether there will be an audio version. The answer is yes. I've recorded it. It will be out on Audible in March as well. So I'm going to read you a chapter from this book, and then at the end of this video, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the book's about in general, and also I'm going to tell you a bit about what I've learnt from the process of writing this book. Let's get started. So this case is about Miss Dorina Boyko. So I should say before I start that I always change the names of the people involved to protect their identity. I change demographic factors, but the essence of my cases are 100% real. So please excuse if I come across rude. That's just me. That's just how a psychiatrist has got to be. But my cases are still genuine with a capital G. Just ask my colleagues in my practice. They're as real as can be. Right, let's get started. So, Ms. Dorina Boyko. She was a recently divorced woman in her mid-30s. She was from the Ukraine. She used to be a model. And she was facing multiple charges related to a convoluted £1 million swindle. She'd apparently intentionally missold carbon credits and was in cahoots with a cousin and her ex-boss who she had an affair with for several years. That's relevant to later on. So it was a sophisticated fraud. I won't go into all the details, but it involved forging documents, making bank accounts, attending meetings. So it's not something that was, done once impulsively. It was cold and calculated. And she received more than £2.5 million in corrupt payments over 6 years, siphoned some of that off to her codependent. So this was an independent fitness to plead assessment, and I was asked to do this on behalf of the Crown Prosecution Service because there'd already been one done by the defence, and they basically smelt the rat. They didn't believe they didn't believe what the defence report was saying. So as I outlined in my book, it's actually quite rare for a forensic psychiatrist such as myself to see fraud cases because, to be blunt, when you're having symptoms of mental illness such as hearing voices, telling you deserve to die, or you've got paranoid delusions about the CIA trying to follow you or kill you, you're more likely to strike out aggressively or violently and impulsively rather than commit this complicated fraud. Skullduggery requires clarity of thought, is what I said to sound clever in my book. Okay, so according to the first court report, Dorina was privately educated, culturally motivated, forced into piano, ballet, Latin. Her parents were overbearing and critical. So she might have had a challenging upbringing, but I think it's fair to say much less harsh than the vast majority of my patients who come from backgrounds of, abuse, violence, etc., etc. So she had obtained an economics degree at a prestigious university. She previously had a six-figure salaried, high-pressure job in trading. She'd married a multimillionaire CEO, 20 years older, although they're kind of separated by the time this court case came around. Quick quote from my book. They lived in Mayfair, a very exclusive area of London, home to the odd billionaire oligarch and A-list celebrity, its ostentatiousness reflected by its extortionate price on the Monopoly board. Monopoly players out there, you know what I'm talking about. Then I talked a little bit about how her cousin had been caught in this scam and the financial breadcrumbs led back to Dorina, which is why she was being tried. She actually had been tried the year before I met her, but the criminal trial was stopped because of her 5-year-old son developing a rare form of leukemia. Again, that is relevant. But when I saw her, she'd been retried, but both of her co-defendants were already found guilty and they were already incarcerated. So let's get to Dorina's current trial. So she flat out refused to engage in the court process. She ignored letters from her own solicitors. When they did speak to her, she was crying, full of tears. She claimed that she had depression due to the situation with her son and also a breakdown of her marriage. According to her medical notes, her GP didn't seem, I didn't think, particularly that concerned about her health. So, for example, her GP didn't refer her on to community mental health services. She did see a private psychiatrist who'd written a remarkably brief letter confirming the diagnoses that she had proposed. And I wrote in my book, if I was cynical, which I am, I might suspect that some people pay private psychiatrists to write spurious letters for their personal gain, which they do. And I think that some even use them for dodgy evidence, which is what I think Dorina was trying to do. And for reasons that I go into my book, I just didn't think this letter was particularly well structured. So there was all these claims of diagnoses, but there wasn't like a description of the relevant symptomatology. So it was spurious, to be polite. Similarly, Dorina's previous fitness to plead assessment was undertaken by a very senior, very experienced forensic psychiatrist on behalf of the defence. His name was on the spine of the many textbooks I had read or purchased with the genuine intent to read eventually. I still do intend to read them someday. So the Crown Prosecution Service found that his conclusions were dubious, and that's why they instructed me for a second opinion. And I have to say that in my opinion, and as I said in the book, it's just my opinion, I think she duped this first doctor, this first forensic psychiatrist. I think her dramatic, tearful presentation clouded his judgment. So when I assessed Dorina, she presented as a very smartly dressed woman, pristine suit, designer handbag, snooty comments. She was very striking, she was very pretty. She was extremely tearful throughout the interview. She cried heavily, often for minutes at a time. She was also quite passive aggressive. So I'll give you an example, as I said in my book. After I introduced myself, I asked, as is standard, do you understand why the court has asked me to assess you? Those bastards want to separate me from my children and you want to help them, she replied, dabbing at her eyes. So basically I felt that she was being deliberately obstructive. I think she was very touchy, she was very guarded. She was very evasive when speaking about her alleged offences. So she'd give me replies like, how many times must I tell you? I never keep track of my incomings and outgoings. It was pocket change for me. But, and here's the important bit, she was able to discuss other topics such as her childhood and a previous employment in detail without the waterworks. And I just felt that there were certain other elements of her case that didn't add up. So she claimed to have this debilitating depression, but her GP didn't feel the need to escalate her care, as I said. She had some recommendations from this private psychiatrist, such as seeing a psychotherapist, but she hadn't followed through. And another big red flag for me was Dorina's level of functioning. So she was able to take her children out to the park on a daily basis. She drove to medical appointments. She attended the odd spin class. She went for a run. She would cook most days. And although we were both encumbered with small children, I did not have a nanny like she did. And I felt her lifestyle sounded more exciting and fulfilling than mine. So this all occurred a few years ago when my kids were young. And yeah, what I said in my book is accurate. I remember thinking that her lifestyle and her functioning was just better than mine. She was able to do more than I could with two 2 kids. The reason I think that's relevant is because that doesn't really reflect somebody who's suffering from a debilitating mental illness. As a forensic psychiatrist, I always look at their level of functioning. To me, it's one of the biggest keys about severity of illness. Some of my colleagues do this, as they should. I've seen some poor psychiatry reports where they only focus on the reported symptomatology. They don't look at the level of functioning. It's a key thing that, in my view, cannot be missed if you're a half-decent psychiatrist. So after some verbal jabbing and weaving and Dorina crying profusely, she realised that I wouldn't allow her to just sidestep discussion about the fraud allegations like the other psychiatrist did. And I also noted that other cracks started appearing. So, for example, she was apparently incapable of remembering the very basic elements of the case. She forgot the name of the co-defendant, who she'd been in an intimate relationship with for over a year and had worked for more than 3 years. So to me, this just didn't ring true. Even if you were severely depressed, you would be able to answer those basic questions. And another issue was that even after I prompted her, she was unable to tell me if any family members, i.e. her cousin, were involved in the case. Again, I was smelling BS. It didn't seem feasible to me that she couldn't answer those questions. So my conclusion was that Dorina's profuse crying, dodging questions, ignoring letters from her solicitors, not talking to her solicitors properly, declining psychiatric treatment, her selective memory loss, all of this were deliberate attempts to evade her trial. So I said that Dorina was capable of the Pritchard criteria, which is what defines fitness to plead, but was intentionally choosing not to cooperate. That's what I said in my court report. That's what I said on the witness stand at the Old Bailey. And during cross-examination, the defence barrister, so her barrister's main argument was that my assessment was limited because I hadn't properly elicited all the information from the specific Pritchard criteria, which is true, but I couldn't because Dorina would not cooperate. So we went into this sort of circular argument where he kept making the same point and kept trying to sort of say that my assessment wasn't of the standard needed for such an important trial, and I kept saying, well, this is the best I can do and she's not cooperating. I expect the judge to intervene, but he did not. What I wrote in my book is to engage into some retrospective damage control of my personal image. To be clear, I am a father and I do have a heart. Those 2 things are still true, even if my heart is somewhat calloused by years of analysing a horrific act of violence. And I fully appreciated that Dorina was going through a traumatic period with the illness of her son. She probably did have a degree of depression and anxiety. And I accept that there might have been humanitarian reasons that the court might not wish to put Dorina through a criminal trial. In fact, I specifically wrote that in my court report. I said, if the judge wished to drop the charge on compassionate grounds, I was fine with that. I had no qualms with that. What I objected to was her using mental illness as a smokescreen. So in the end, the judge actually ignored my opinion. So the judge thought that Dorina was unfit to plead. And as I wrote in my book, I was and still am fairly certain that this was the incorrect call. But I also knew that my place was as an advisor only. The judge has the ultimate say. Personally, I thought that the image of the courts dragging in a grieving mother with a sick child who was previously dying was just unpalatable. And I also think that having the main 2 perpetrators behind bars was a concession of sorts. So compassion overruling justice in this particular case was not unreasonable in my view, but it should have been a legal decision, not a clinical one. Otherwise, the system itself is also at risk of using mental illness as a smokescreen. Dun, dun, dun. Damning words in what can only be described as a cutting-edge book. I'm sure you'll agree. So in my book, I'm not going to mention them now, but in my book, I talked about other cases that this reminded me of. So one of Anna Sorikin, who committed fraud around the same time as Dorina. She's Russian-born German, moved to New York City. She conned a bank out of around $100,000. And she had access to 60 million euros. So she committed a very high level of fraud, also had some similar personality traits. She was very entitled, had lack of empathy, etc., etc. Also, what I talked about in my book was the case of Kenneth Bianchi, otherwise known as the Hillside Strangler. If you're a true crime fan, you've probably heard of this case. For you who don't know, he was apprehended for about a dozen murders of young women in California between October 1977 and February 1978. He buried them in the surrounding hills, hence the moniker, the Hillside Strangler, along with his cousin. So I won't go into it now, but I kind of dissect into my book how he created a false narrative of him suffering from multiple personality disorder. He actually tricked quite a few forensic psychiatrists, my own brethren, who frankly I thought were very naive, but he was tricked by a trickster. So there was a psychologist to Martin Orne, I don't know if that's Orne, O-R-N-E, who made Bianchi change his story by telling him certain mistruths about that diagnosis. So it's a very sort of clever way of trapping him and making him look guilty. If you want to know more about it, buy my book. Then I go on about how I actually go through the process of trying to decide if a defendant's lying to me. So as I'm sure you won't massively surprise you, some defendants try to lie to me. They try and exaggerate mental illness for leniency or because they want to be sent to hospital. And I've expanded about how the strategies that I use to try and catch people out or when I can tell that people are faking it. I've actually done a whole series of videos on this somewhere on this channel, a Faking It series. Go and check it out. I think it was 3 parts. Okay, so that's enough. That hopefully gives you a little taste of what my book is about. Hope you enjoyed that. Obviously go cop a copy if you can. So just briefly, my book is a bit similar to that. So it's kind of chronological. It's split into 3 sections. So there's when I worked in secure psychiatric units, which are reserved for high-risk patients. Then there's a section about when I worked as a psychiatrist in prison and what that was like and the kind of presentations I saw. And then finally, there's the last bit, which is when I worked as an expert witness, which is what I do now. So lots of court cases, not guilty by reason of insanity, diminished responsibility, just talking about all those kinds of assessments that I do. So the book's kind of chronological and it's peppered with my interesting cases. I compare them to high-profile true crime cases that you've heard of. It's a little bit funny, I like to think, a little bit silly, a little bit surreal. So why should you buy that book? That's the ultimate question, because I will make money. No, sorry, that came out wrong. I meant to say you should buy my book because you should buy my book because it's educational, tells you about the world of forensic psychiatry. It's interesting and it is also fun. Okay, I want to tell you a little bit about what I learnt from the process of writing my book. So I have made some unsuccessful attempts at writing fiction before, but this is the first time I've ever written something like this. So one thing I learnt was how poor my memory is. Like I have a pathologically bad memory. I looked through the notes, my previous reports on my computer, on my hard drive, to kind of inspire me and to pick out cases to talk about in my book. And not only had I forgotten details of cases, but I'm a little bit embarrassed to say I forgot many entire cases and quite like significant cases, you know, serious assaults, stabbings, fires. And I think that reflects my poor memory, but it also reflects the vast number of cases that I've seen. So I've seen, God, I don't even know, probably somewhere between 300 and 500 criminal cases in my career. And they all kind of, they often blend into one. And so, yeah, so I learned that I had forgotten about cases, but luckily writing my book has kind of reignited that. And the other thing that's kind of connected to that is I was surprised at some cases that I did remember. And going through it all, I didn't understand then, and I still don't really understand now why I remember some cases. So there are some cases where the violence committed isn't really that shocking. It's just like a low-level assault, and the person I assessed isn't particularly that unusual, or there's nothing that stands out about their persona. But for some weird reason, I can remember them. I can remember their face. I can remember seeing them. Like I can remember the prison visit, for example. Whereas other cases, far more horrific violence, and I've forgotten about them. So I guess I've learned that my memory and my priorities in my head is illogical, I suppose. The other thing I learned from writing the book, because part of the book was this process, was that there's more connections between my cases than I'd realised. So different elements of childhood. I mean, there's you know, the obvious ones like being the childhood abuse. That's obvious. That is a very common theme that runs through my patient demographic. But individuals making statements that I'd written down and put in my reports, like the shame of being specifically bullied by like an older sibling, for example. has happened in a number of my patients, but I'd forgotten those connections because they'd happened, each of the cases was so far in between. So that's something else that I learned. Okay, before I finish, I just want to quickly shout out this channel, introduce you to it if you don't know. It's called A Psych for Sore Minds. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. So I assess mentally disordered offenders in courts and in prisons and in psychiatric units. I act as an expert witness. Basically everything that I said that my book is about. This channel is a smorgasbord of cases and topics and areas. Sometimes I talk about individual diagnoses, like I've done a video recently about why I think autism is being overdiagnosed. Sometimes I talk about true high-profile cases. So for example, I've done a video recently about Catherine Knight, who's the first Australian woman to ever have a life sentence with a full tariff because she killed her husband, decapitated him, cooked his body parts, and I kid you not, she tried to feed them to his own children, although thankfully the police intervened before that last bit happened. I talk about generic topics related to criminality, such as why the crime rate has changed during the pandemic, which things have increased, which things have decreased, such as the psychology behind domestic violence, psychology behind fraud and lying, etc., etc. What I'm trying to say is there's something for everybody on this channel. Please subscribe. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it actually makes you better at Scrabble. Guaranteed all your money back. Very last thing I want to say is I'm going to do another, at least one, maybe two episodes where I'll be reading out chapters from my book. So if you have any questions that you want me to address specifically about the book, not necessarily the content, but more about the process, like the process of writing it, what I've learned, etc., etc., please do ask in the comments section, and I promise I'll try my best to answer as many, if not all, of those questions in my next video about my book. Obviously, go and cop this book. There will be links about pre-ordering it, and it will come out March the 10th. And that's pretty much all I have to say for now. Get on with your day. Go and do something important. Live your life. All that remains is to say, stay euthymic, and whatever happens, please do not forget. Please. I love you.